He had a beautiful fountain and, you know, stools, and we all gathered there. It was a gathering place, really.
A single dip ice cream cone was 3 cents, and a double dip ice cream cone was 5 cents.
The drinks used to be a fountain glass, about this tall. 2 cents seltzer they used to cost.
In the early 1900s, many Russian Jews were leaving their homes and coming to America to start new lives, better lives. This is the story of one of those immigrants, Nathan Sosin. It is a remarkable story, repeated by many. Nate Sosin came to America alone as a 19-year-old, speaking not a word of English. He ultimately settled in Detroit, where he raised a family and established a neighborhood business known as Sosin'S Sodas. This is also the story of how Nate Sosin's confectionery store became an important social gathering spot for many people in the local Jewish community.
When Nate left Russia, I was just a kid, but I remember distinctly that my father didn't want him to serve in the army, so he went in the army, but he had a 10-day leave. So he came home, and my father got a passport, for him to leave, to go to America.
He came from Russia, went east through Siberia. This is on his own as an 18 or 19-year-old. Into Japan, left from Japan to the United States, and came through the West Coast, I believe Portland, Oregon, or maybe Seattle, I'm not sure which. Came here not speaking a word of English, and made a success for his family.
When they emigrated to the United States, they had, whoever was here first would have everybody else stay with them. So they had many different families that lived together for a long time, and until they got married and got on their feet and were able to go out and be on their own.
He went to New York, and my uncle was a barber. So he said the only thing you can give him a job is in the barber shop. So he says, be a barber. So he had one of those big barber shops, about 20 chairs, and a nickel a shave and a dime a haircut. And he gets a big heavy-set guy in the chair, and he didn't know how to operate a chair even. Finally, he gets him set up, and he lathers up his face, and he's going to shave him. And the first thing you know, he cuts right into the face. And the blood starts running, and he takes off his coat. He says, Uncle, that's the end of my career.
Nathan eventually came to Detroit, where Henry Ford was offering $5 a day to work in the automotive factories. An accident on the line ended his short career in the automotive business, but it opened the door for his next venture, the confectionery business. Nathan could never have imagined that first storefront soda shop on Theodore and Hastings would be the beginning of a long and successful career.
He bought the store on Theodore and Hastings, which had a fountain. It had 2 tables. Those, what do you call those tables? The round tables, with the chairs, ice cream parlor chairs.
When I was born, we lived on Calvert, and the store was, I believe they had the store for a year or 2 on Hastings, but then moved shortly thereafter to 12th Street.
Sosin'S Sodas became a regular fixture in the community. With Nathan's business now established, he sent for his family to come to America.
When I came to the United States, I was 12 years old. And Nate took us in, and we had a home, and it was very nice. I had an uncle here, and my uncle and Nate came to pick us up at the depot, at a train, because we landed in Quebec, and we took a train from Quebec to Detroit. And it was a long ride, and finally we arrived, and they came and picked us up. I never knew my brother. I never knew my brother. I never knew my uncle. I didn't know either one of them. It was strangers.
Just married and starting on their own, Nate Sosin and his new bride Minnie took in Nate's brother Max, his sister Esther, and their mother. Nate was more than 10 years older than his siblings, and he had the responsibility of taking care of his family. Family and friends remember Nathan was a rather formidable man.
My father had a very strong personality, and I think he was one of the reasons that the store was so successful, because he wasn't a bland personage behind the counter. Everybody knew him, and I think generally he was very well liked.
Nate was strong-willed, affectionate, but not really showing affection too much. And he liked people, and he liked to talk. And he loved being in the store. I think that was his favorite exercise. Work to him was something that made a lot of sense out of life.
And also, I have to say that he was a very physically strong person. Because even though working in a confectionery store doesn't sound like it involves a lot of lifting, it does. Lifting tins of ice cream, scooping ice cream, you develop your wrists. And he was famous for the finger, which was, first of all, he only had 3 full fingers on one hand, having worked in a press in his earlier days when he came to this country, and lost parts of 2 of his fingers.
Half finger that he had became very strong, and he had a habit that he'd tap you on the shoulder like this, with that little thumb. Would hurt like crazy. It was very strong, and he would tap you like this here. So you try to avoid him tapping you.
People would actually succumb and get down on their knees, and he was able, without getting them angry, to be able to leave the store. So he didn't force them to get out, but this was sort of a kibbutz, and he was able to make them understand that this was the end of their game and that they had to call it quits at that point.
I often remember people saying, "Not the finger, Nate, not the finger."
But I remember he was a big, formidable, I thought at that time he was about 7 foot tall and about 300 pounds, and of course he wasn't, but he was a big, physically impressive person, and he brooked no nonsense. You came in, you transacted your business, and goodbye,
Well, the stories are legion. I'm not sure if they're all true, but supposedly the neighborhood, 12th Street neighborhood, was filled with members of the Purple Gang, the notorious Jewish gangsters of those days, who were mostly involved in, I think, rum running and gambling and that sort of thing. And the story is that he threw them out of the store, forbid them to come. He didn't want any bums hanging around the store. Now, I'm not sure how true that is, but that's the story.
Nathan's wife Minnie was the oldest of the 9 Sakenic children. Also born to parents of Russian Jewish descent, Minnie came with her family to the United States as a young girl. She was a devoted wife, working beside her husband in the store, as well as raising their 4 children, Hilbert, Alan, Ralph, and Janet.
Minnie was always reserved, always. She used to take care of the customers and so forth. She was friendly with them, but she was never outgoing, let me put it that way. You had to engage her in conversation. That was her nature.
Minnie was quieter. Minnie got into her own after my father died and became much more of a personality with her grandchildren than she was with her own children, I believe. She always was either taking care of people or her family, or she was taking care of the store, or taking care of the kids, or starting a new family club, or arranging something for the family to meet. So she was a little bit of a balaboss, a little bit of a aspect that she was the director and everybody else followed.
My mother, in those days, was much more of a quiet, secondary kind of personality. No, that doesn't do her justice, because she had her role, which was the care of the family, but it was very much a man-ruled home in those days. And I've said to many people that my mother really didn't blossom in her life until after my father was gone. My mother lived some, I think, 25 years at least beyond my father's death, and really became a much more open person at that time.
Well, she was a very devoted mother, that's for sure, and a devoted wife, because she worked with her husband all the time. And as far as I can remember, Minnie worked in the store until just before Janet was born, as far as I can remember.
Minnie was not the greatest cook in the world, you know. I mean, she didn't like cooking, but she cooked because she had to. So I wasn't crazy about her cooking, although I never complained. I ate, but many times the meal was so bad that I used to get through eating and go outside and go to the restaurant and have a meal. That's right. She was not a good cook.
Well, what did we know in those days? You know, we thought her cooking was good. Now, early on, almost entirely living on 12th Street, the entire family never, and I mean never, ate at the same time, because somebody had to be in the store.
Although meals might not have been eaten together, the family unit was very strong. Their family life was dominated by the family business, Sosin'S sodas. In those days, it was common for families to live right above the family business. Growing up, the Sosin'S found this arrangement had its advantages and disadvantages.
Living above the store was nothing to me. It was a place to live.
I was born on Gladstone and 12th Street, which is where the store was, and we lived above the store. Kind of a typical experience in those days. You don't see it anymore. There were what I would call flats above the store, with rickety wood porches on the back that looked out over an alley and so forth, and stores down below.
So we lived above the store with Mother and Dad going downstairs all the time and upstairs. That's why Minnie was such a terrible cook, because she'd go upstairs at 3 o'clock and put on the meat, because we were eating at 6 o'clock.
The advantage of that was that since my mother and father and brother Hilbert all worked in the store at that time, as well as Alan and I, but in a very limited way, when my father wanted to take an hour's nap, he'd come upstairs, my mother would go downstairs, and there'd be no travel time involved.
The family was the important structure at that point, because It went to grandmother and all the uncles, and there were large families, and all the holidays were done together as a group, and the store was just a place that families were able to meet. So the family itself was the basic structure of our community.
In those days, when you had a store, the family had the store. For example, in our case on Hastings Street, when I was 6 years old, I was making cash. I was the only kid in my class that could make change. You know, and when I was 6, 7 years old, I used to have a box behind the cash register that I was able to, to climb on and make change. And I waited on customers when I was, I couldn't see over the counter half the time. But that's the way it was at Sosin'S. The Hilbert was there, of course, he was the oldest, and Ralph was there.
The reason you only had family in the store was because it was affordable. I mean, first of all, you had to give family a job because that's the way the family survived, and you didn't have to pay them that much because that's what kept the business going, and you could trust them, so you always did these things that were trustworthy.
What it meant was a means, a livelihood. Number one, it was very important. And the fact is that also, in my position as just a newcomer, I had to have contact, and it gave me contact. So that's what made it so great.
I started working there in October of 1930, before I was 15 years old. So I used to come in at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and work until 11 o'clock at night. That was 4 days a week because Friday night I didn't work. Used to come in Saturday night after the Sabbath. And then Sunday I used to come in from 11 to 11 for $5 a week.
Predominantly it was the dishwasher. I remember that more than anything else, probably because I hated it. But eventually I got to the point where I was able to work behind the counter. But remember a couple of things. First of all, Hilbert was 5 years older than me. And being 5 years older than me gave him the prerogative of working behind the counter while I was the flunky that worked and did the dishes.
My earliest memories of there being a store are my earliest memories, because the store was ever present. We lived above it, but we lived in it. And so I was always very involved with the store, and we started, I would say, quote, working when we were very young, 7, 8 years old. We'd stand behind the candy counters and take pennies from kids. I was low man on the totem pole, I have to tell you, that because I was the youngest until my sister Janet came along, who never really worked at the store at all. So I was always the youngest family member working there, and I was assigned the most menial tasks, which usually meant, until I was a teenager at least, meant washing dishes and cleaning off the tables.
I used to go to school, and after school I used to work in the store every day. My brother used to give me a half a day off sometimes on a Saturday. I used to go to the theater. I didn't get paid for 3 years, nothing, until one day, after 3 years, Nate asked me, says to me, he wants to give me some money. So he gave me a couple of dollars. I really didn't want it.
Obviously, you could never have the whole family assembled. There might have been a rare Sunday afternoon where either Hilbert or one of my uncles was tending the store, and we would get together and take a drive into the country, usually out to Mount Clements.
And we would all have to sample the ice creams from somebody else's store.
It was sort of a busman's holiday, and then we'd come back. And that's one way the family got together.
I don't remember the stores being all-consuming. The only thing I do remember is that after school, you had to do some work, and you worked in the store, and you worked for a certain number of hours, and then. But we were able to. We had friends, so it was not overwhelmingly consuming in that it was not our life. It was not something that we felt that, or I felt that I would be doing when I grew up. So it was a job, and it was a way to make life easier for my parents, and that was it.
The store was not my social life. The store was the chief interference with my social life. There were times I can remember in high school, for example, when I had things to do, invitations to a party or something, where I had to turn them down because I had to work in the store that night. And that was an obligation which I recognized. I didn't like it, but we, it was a family venture, and we had to do it.
As the Jewish community migrated out to the 12th Street area of Detroit, so did Sosin'S Sodas. Nathan sold the Hastings store and moved to his second store at 12th Street and Gladstone.
The 12th Street store was a good store. The 12th Street store, my brother bought it from a fellow who had it, and it was a flop. The fellow that had it didn't do any business. Sold it to him, Nate, for about, $200 or something like that. Bought it very cheap.
Well, they had a fountain. As you came in the store, it had a cigar stand, a cigarette stand, right as you came in the door. Then it had a fountain with all the stools. Then they had, around the side of the store, they had these booths. And then in the store, they had 2 or 3, 4 different tables, that you sit up beside the booths.
I know that I never waited on a customer. The customers were waited on by Nate, my brother Nate, or Minnie. That was the only 2 people. So it was pretty busy in the summertime. Had a lot of, quite a lot of business. So everybody was being occupied. So I was doing nothing. So I figured I'll wait on it. So a lady comes in. I asked her, and I used to have trouble with one word, what kind and what time. I didn't know the difference, which is which. So I says to her, what time? So she says, there's a clock, take a look, I said, no. I says, what time? So finally she complained to my brother. He says that this kid is crazy. He wants to know, all of a sudden, he wants to know what time it is. He says to me, what are you bothering her for? I says, I wanted to know what she wanted.
The only time I worked there in the store was, during the time before the Jewish holidays. They had some. They used to have New Year's cards. They used to sell fancy New Year's cards, and they used to set up a stand outside the door, and I would sit there and sell these New Year's cards for about a week or 2 weeks before the holiday.
My earliest recollection is when Sosin'S opened. As part of an opening day promotion, they gave away ice cream bars, what we would call an Eskimo bar today. And I think I was one of the first visitors, and I got my free ice cream bar, and then an hour or so later, I tried to sneak through for a second freebie, and Nate Sosin'S spotted me, and of course he knew our family, and just picked me up and escorted me out and said, don't come back here today.
I remember I used to, when I finally got worked up a little bit, I was in charge of making chocolate syrup. We used to make our own chocolate. So you make for the whole week. Maybe 8-10 gallons of chocolate, and it took time till I learned, but I learned.
One of my favorite, or least favorite, I should say, jobs was to sit in the back room on 12th Street, where we had a huge vat cooking the chocolate syrup. And my job, since in those days there were flies all over the place, was to keep the pot stirred while it was cooking, and to make sure that if any flies hit the surface, to pick them out before they sunk. And I was pretty good at that. So never heard any complaints about customers finding chocolate-covered raisins in their drinks. So I think I got most of the flies out.
I'm trying to recall whether they had a table in the back of the store and they used to play pinochle there. I'm trying to recall it, and I can't.
We were living on 12th when Orson Welles did the War of the Worlds. And I remember that we were upstairs and we turned on the program late, and we ran downstairs. We're being invaded, and that everybody, we turned on the radio downstairs, and we were all convinced that actually this was something that was really going on.
The 12th Street store was very successful. The story goes that customers often stood 3 deep on a busy Saturday night.
Even though we're talking about a little candy store here, it took, on a busy night, 5, maybe more people, I would say 5 or 6 people to really operate it, because we're talking 2 and 3 deep of customers standing there, and you had to have a lot of people operating this venture.
It was busy. And the people that did have a little money could come in Saturday night and spend the money. How much money can you spend? If a banana split is a quarter. If a fellow take out a girl, he buys a banana split, $50 for the 2 of them.
Saturday night would be busy in the store. There were other nights during the weeks it depended. Summertime was a busy time at the store because people were out on the streets and walking the streets. Remember, we didn't have air conditioning. And we had fans.
At times, I'll tell you this, frankly. At times at 7 o'clock at night, you start taking orders. You didn't have time to look up and see who you were talking to. You just, until 11 o'clock, you just dished it out. Either all across the fountain or run to the booth, get an order and fill it and bring it back.
A lot of my friends used to come and hang around. They didn't have the money, so they just hung around. You can't live on that. So they ought to get him out, because there wasn't too much room in the store. He would push him along a little bit. He says, to the boots, to the boots. They used to socialize, They came to spend an evening. And he used to, it didn't chase him out, but it made him so that they have to leave.
Life on 12th Street was very simple in the 1930s. The neighborhood was predominantly Jewish, with the Jewish shop owners, Jewish patrons, and businesses catering to the Jewish people. Each block was like the next one, and people didn't have to go far to find whatever they needed.
The neighborhood was very, very nice, and it was small. We lived when we lived on 12th Street. It was just a couple of blocks along the neighborhood, and you didn't really have. Nobody had a car. If one of the boys had a car, we'd all chip in and buy gasoline, fill the tank, 10 cents a gallon. 10 cents a gallon. For $1, we fill up a tank.
It was a very thriving, busy neighborhood because they had so many stores there, bakeries and butcher shops, fish markets, fruit markets. But it was very busy there. And, a lot of Jewish people living there. And it was fun.
Oh yeah, these were places that people would go to every day. I used to work behind the counter of the bakery, I was 9, 10 years old, and you'd see the same faces. They'd come in the morning and they'd come in the afternoon frequently. And they knew you on a first name basis and you knew them.
Stores were fairly small, and you would go from a candy store to a barber shop to a butcher shop to a deli to a grocery store. Usually the grocery stores were the bigger ones of the group. A bakery across the street. There was always a little cafe. There was the Cream of Michigan was down the street where the Purple Gang met. There was Boesky's that was further down the street where they had a number of untoward incidents, and again the Purple Gang was there. So that within 4 or 5 blocks you had everything that you could possibly need in order to live a very comfortable life.
We couldn't afford anything where we would have had to spend any kind of money. So we stayed more or less around the neighborhood. Cream of Michigan, Boesky's used to get a corned beef sandwich for 15 cents, and then you split it. And that was the time of our young years.
It was different than now, where everybody lives so far away, you don't really see your neighbors much. It was closer, the houses were close together, and people sat on their porches and everybody knew each other. It was very different then.
The areas probably were very mixed ethnically in both cases, but we didn't know it. We thought that we were living in a basically Jewish neighborhood. Not so much where we lived after we moved from 12th Street, because we didn't live near the store in those days. We lived on Collingwood and Lawton in quite a mixed religious and ethnic neighborhood. But on Dexter, you were quite insulated. Then, of course, we got into Central High School, where my brother Al and I went. That was a principally Jewish school. What the percentages were, I don't know, but I know that there was more than 50% Jewish, probably closer to 75, 80%. So it was an insulated experience. Until we really went away to college, we were living in kind of a self-imposed ghetto.
It was a community. Everybody was right next to each other, and there were lots of flats above the stores. There was an apartment further down the street on 12th, and the theater was, everything was walking distance. In fact, that's what everybody did. They did their paseo after they came home for work, and that's what our store provided, was the place for the people to meet.
We were in such a deep depression, we did not have the places to go because we had no money to spend. So we naturally were in the neighborhood, and this was our entertainment.
You can't spend the money, didn't have the money. None of them had money. So you come in to the store for a nickel, you get a drink. A soda was 10 cents. A sundae was 10 cents. The expensive thing was a banana split, a quarter. 25 cents for banana split. I mean a real banana split. 3 scoops of ice cream and a full banana with everything. 25 cents.
When I tell my children some of these things, they look at me and they say, "Oh, Nanny, couldn't have been that bad. Couldn't have been." And you can't make people understand how really bad it was. Now, I'm speaking about 1928. Now, I was 16 years old, and this is when I met my husband, 1928. And there just wasn't anything. I mean, we couldn't, although he drove a car, and, you know, we always had a car to ride in, rumble seat. And for some reason, we always found enough money to buy gasoline, which probably, I can't tell you how much it was at the time, but I know it wasn't much. So that was the whole thing.
And of course, there were people from the neighborhood, the regulars, who are remembered to this day.
Frequently, the same group of people, that's where they met. It was a community place, and there were a lot of community places that people would either meet and talk on the street, they'd come in and have a drink, they'd sit around and just schmooze, they'd buy a penny candy, they'd read the magazines, they'd read the newspapers and then leave the newspapers there and the magazines there. So they didn't spend a lot of money, but they spent a lot of time.
There were a lot of peculiar characters that used to come in, but we were used to them, you know, so it's making a difference.
I remember Uncle Max had a group of boyfriends who would come in all of the time, and they were all wisecrackers.
My husband knew Max much better than I did. He was one of the boys, you know. So if we were going out and we were strolling, let's stop at Max's and we'll have a 2 cents plain or soda. We called them sodas. We didn't call them anything, you know. And that was the extent of our entertainment at that time.
Or I used to get the youngsters that hung around into one of the booths or something like that. Of course, at night, we don't want them there. It's just during the day. And we used to have a couple of couples that used to come in, maybe one especially used to come once a month, a man and a woman. They order a couple Cokes, and they sit in the booth for 2 hours until they finally left. So, you know, we didn't know what was going on. We just served them, and that's all. We didn't pay any attention to them. But that was during the day when the booths were empty, so we didn't care. At night, it was a different story. At night, the booths were always busy, especially in the summertime, very busy. You used to put 4, 6, 8 people in a booth.
One man who used to come in occasionally, a very timid little Jewish man who, if you don't mind my telling this story, but he came in one time when I was there alone. And so this had to be on Dexter, I would think, because he came in and said, where's your father? And I said, he's not here. And he said, so it's you. And that's the story.
There were a number of regulars that Mr. Sosin knew personally, or they came in because of the attractions that were there in the way of the specialties that he had. And in those days, there wasn't more than vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry ice cream. Occasionally, we get butter pecan or something like that. But that was basically it, that standard fare.
There is a story that I've been told before my time that Mr. Corman, who is the father of friends of mine, used to run his bag and barrel business out of the store, which had a telephone. So the telephone was always answered in a nondescript way, so that if it was for Corman's business, he could run down from wherever he was to answer the phone as though this were his office.
There were always people around that were odd in these neighborhoods. I remember Henry O'Boy, who was an individual that had a bike, and on his bike he had bells and chimes, and he had baskets, and he had collections of different things that he had accumulated, whether they be model airplanes or small little cars, racing cars, and he was a very odd character. Henry O'Boy would come up and talk to kids. He never seemed to be menacing to anybody, and occasionally he would stop in the store and get something to drink. How he made his living and how he maintained that bike, which was like a rolling home, I don't know.
The confectionery business was a business of pennies, and Nate and Minnie worked hard for their pennies. They built a family business that allowed them to live a comfortable life and eventually put 4 children through college.
Nate was a good businessman, but he was poor in those days. He knew that he had to save money because spend as little as possible.
Max, he always trusted. And after I worked there for about 4 or 5 years, he used to trust me. But he was careful about who he trusted. That's very true. Because in those days, don't forget, that's a penny business. Nate was always an exacting boss. There's no question about it. But still, he was good-hearted. In other words, if you wanted anything to eat in the store while you're working there, go ahead. There's no question about it.
He was on his feet all the time. It was hard. I do remember that behind the counter we had an elevated wooden planks that you walked on so that the water and everything wouldn't affect your feet. But it was hard. You were standing all the time. It wasn't a sitting job. You were standing and working.
Well, a soda jerk can be defined in many ways, but it was because you jerked the handle of the carbonator forward, and as you jerked that, the water, which was carbonated, came into a glass, and you had to be very careful that it was jerked or pulled properly, because as Mr. Sosin pointed out to me when I first started learning how to make sodas, if that spray or the carbonated water would hit the ice cream, that would turn to ice. So you had to have that jerked properly. You had to hold your glass properly so that the carbonated water would hit the side of the glass and not the ice cream.
He used to watch how you were making your ice cream cones and your sodas. If you used to put too much ice cream, he used to let you know about it, because he had it pretty well measured out how much a can of ice cream used to last. And he didn't want you to be over generous, especially another thing too. In those days, we used to sell our ice cream in pints and a quarts. We used to pack it ourselves. And you had to know how to pack it, because ice cream is soft. And if you push down, you can put in practically a quart of ice cream in a pint if you push too hard. So you have to watch yourself. You have to know how to handle your scoop and everything else.
There was only one boss, and that was Nathan. Nathan was a very strong-willed person, and he ran things.
Advertise? What's that? No, he never advertised. It was word of mouth. It was just people in the community that would stop by.
The story is that when 1:45 came in the evening, my dad would go outside and look around on 12th Street
To see if anybody was walking on the street, because he wouldn't close the store until they walked by, see, in case they would possibly come in and buy something.
When we moved, he later softened the hours quite a bit, and eventually, and this was a big move for him, eventually closed on Friday nights so that he could observe the Jewish Sabbath.
Amongst the family members who worked at the store, the eldest son, Hilbert, took on an increasingly larger role. Hilbert had his own plans for the family business, but convincing Nate was another story.
Hilbert was really stuck with the principal burden. First of all, Hilbert was 7 years older than I, and almost a little more than 5 years older than my brother Al. And particularly on 12th Street, he was the only one old enough to work in the store, and he did a great deal. He was really living at home, working at the store, going to school, doing all of those things. Very much carrying the heaviest burden of all of us.
Hilbert was given a lot of responsibility running the store because Dad would need to take time off, and either Mother had to spell him and he would go upstairs and take a nap, or Hilbert would. And there's the famous story about Hilbert being in the store by himself a number of years, and they used to have pinball machines, and it was illegal for anybody to give a prize for winning a sporting game. And this guy came in day after day and played the pinball machine and worked on Hilbert to give him something because he was getting good at playing pinball. And finally, one day, he had a fantastic score on the pinball machine, and Hilbert acquiesced and gave him a pack of cigarettes, at which time the guy pulled out his badge, arrested Hilbert, and took him downtown to the police station, and they started to book him. Fortunately, we had a relative who was involved with the police and the government, and they were able to get Hilbert off without anything being on his record for gambling.
Hilbert, he was the one most interested in the store. He had some ideas on expanding and turning this into some kind of major enterprise from a little candy store. For example, we were famous for our chocolate syrups, our chocolate phosphates. We made the chocolate ourselves, and he started a little company at one point. I can't remember whether this was after he left the service, probably, where we cooked it and labeled it and sold it to other confectioners, but didn't last very long.
In today's world of fast food and chain stores, it's remarkable when you think about the sole proprietors and the role they played in building a strong business community in the early 1900s. Sosin'S Sodas might just have been an ice cream parlor, but for many, it was also a Jewish institution.
The store was like an institution, and people in those days lived differently than they live now. You know, they didn't have, sociability was limited. But they had to go out for an evening, go to the candy store. There was an evening of entertainment to go to the candy store to have a drink. And I want to tell you something. The menu was very, very limited. A plain glass of seltzer was 2 cents. 2 cents. That's what they call 2 cent plain.
It was a major social focal point for the neighborhood. That was what you did on a summer evening. You went down and you had an ice cream and or a chocolate soda or something of the sort, and you saw people that you knew. And
but it was a community. It was a meeting place. It was first of all, it was inexpensive. You got a phosphate for 5 cents. You got a 2 cent plain, which was soda water. You had our chocolate syrup, which was famous because it just was different than anybody else's. But it was a place that people would come sit at the booths or sit at the counter and talk, and Nate would spend a lot of time talking to them. He enjoyed talking to them and reminiscing and talking about what was going on.
By the early 40s, the Jewish community was spreading out again, from Hastings to 12th Street, and now from 12th Street to Dexter. And Sosin'S Sodas moved right with it.
And I remember Sosin'S very well. And I remember the whole line of stores. I think Lieberman's Delicatessen was on that block, as I recall. There were several other small merchants on the block. And that, of course, Dexter was a very, very heavily traveled street, a lot of commerce, mostly small merchants. And it was primarily a Jewish area.
Well, it always smelled real good, you know, and it was really a gathering place. The mothers liked to come there and talk and relax. Well, I lived on Richton and Dexter, and all us mothers used to parade down Dexter Boulevard. We called it the Buggy Brigade. And then we'd stop and go into Sosin'S and have a soda, talk about our children. That was our recreation.
Pretty much we stayed behind the counter, although we did have booths and we did take some stuff over to the people at the booths. Now, there were free times when we could experiment with drinks. I remember adding marshmallow topping to a Coke. And what that does is makes the Coca-Cola explode. So that I did that, and the whole counter was all covered with Coke, fizzing all over. So I had to clean it up real fast before my dad came back, because he would have killed me if he'd seen me do that.
There was that training period, which must have been a couple months before I could wait on customers. And then finally I got my great opportunity, and I was able to draw a Coke. Draw a Coke meant you'd pull the server back, and the liquid would come out the bottom into a cup or a glass. And I was about 12 and a half then, and the counters, the soda fountain counters in those days were considerably higher than they were later on when I opened my own drugstore and had a soda fountain. So I drew my Coke and was about to hand it to the customer, and I had to reach up to the counter. And as I reached, of course, the bottom of the Coke glass caught on top of the counter, and the Coke went right on the customer's lap. Well, Mr. Sosin wasn't too pleased with me at that time, and he gave the gentleman a large Coke, no charge, and cleaned him up and so on. But from that point on, I knew I had to stand on my tiptoes if I was going to take care of a customer.
With prosperity came change for many business owners. In Nathan's mind, the store had done just fine the way it was. He did not want it to change.
Hilbert came back from the war, wanted to change the store, modernize things. It was the time that they were just starting to get into more extravagant candy stores in the community. There was the time that they were starting to get more of pre-made supplies and medications, hair tonics, different things, and he wanted to modernize the store. And Dad told him that he had been this way, he'd made a living, he had supported a family, he had started everybody in the family out to be able to work and become successful, and that's the way he was going to leave it, and he didn't want to change.
Most of the merchants and most of the people in Detroit, the Jewish people I'm referring to, were immigrants. And they obviously came in very poor, and there were not very many safety nets in those days, practically none. And they started small businesses. As it became more prosperous, they moved to better areas, better housing and so forth.
It was just success. People were having jobs. Don't forget the Depression was ending. The war in Europe had begun. People had more jobs, they had more money, and they were looking for better living conditions, and they were able to. In the 30s, people were struggling. That's kind of interesting in itself, because I know they were struggling because I've read about it since, but we were very insulated from it in our family. Not that my father had a lot of money, he just made sure that whatever his children needed at any time, we got.
As I remember, he had an offer on the store and just agreed to sell it. I don't remember exactly why. I think at that point he was changing what he needed, and he did not have as much responsibility of raising and supporting children, although Janet was still young. But I don't remember any specific reason that the store was sold.
And so ended the sauce and soda era. But the memories clearly live on. Sauce and Soda's was more than an ice cream store. It was a place to socialize. It was a place to meet and tell stories, maybe a joke or two. It was a Jewish place.
What we did get out of the store was values. We had the values that you treated people as something important. You never tried to downgrade anybody. And you treated people, and one of the major things we were taught was to be honest. That if somebody left the wrong change or got the wrong change, that you ran after them to make sure that they got the proper amount of money in return. That we never cheated anybody. We didn't cheat them by what we gave them. We didn't cheat them by shorting them in what they got back. So that we were always taught values in the store. But that, again, was what the community taught each other. Nobody would think of going across the street and trying to cheat the baker or anybody else.
If they served good food, the customers came. If they took care of them, if they didn't, they were out of business before long. And Sosin'S Sodas, having developed a reputation on 12th Street and then moving to Dexter, certainly had a great following.
I think my father truly enjoyed what he was doing. It was long hours, but he was great at interacting with people. And as I said earlier, I think that was the reason for his success. People liked him. They liked to talk to him. They liked to kibitz with him.
But when you consider that Nate came to the United States by running away from the Russian army, by taking a train across Mongolia, by being a teenager and coming across the Pacific Ocean and landing in Canada and then making his way to New York City and being a barber for 2 days before he came to Detroit. And he came to Detroit because Henry Ford was offering $5 a day for working in the factory, and he went to work in the factory, saved enough money in order to be able to open a store, brought over his sister and his mother and his brother, put them to work, put Minnie's brothers and sisters to work, and that they all were able to take care of each other. And provide for their children. That was what was exciting about the community at that time.
A fellow had an accident. He was knocked out of the car. Policeman come and picked him up, propped him up against the building, and he says, how you doing? He says, okay, thank God I make a nice living.
But I do remember very well the kids coming in and reading the books while standing there.
Absolutely.
And my father always saying, either buy them or put them back. You know, you can't.
But he'd let them read it for a while.
Oh yeah, he'd let them read it for a while.
But I thought it was the cocoa that gave us a little high because we would inhale some of that. You know,
Yeah,
it's powder
right.
you dumped in. It was a 100-pound
That's
bag.
interesting.
I think we walked out high every minute.
First of all, promoting the chocolate syrup as a secret recipe. As Jack and I discussed earlier, there's nothing secret about it. We just use a lot of good ingredients.
Like sugar.
Sugar and
heavy on
cocoa.
chocolate.
Heavy on the cocoa.
Heavy on the chocolate. That's why Hilbert became an accountant, is because Hilbert, when he came back from the service, started to work with my dad. And he did suggest that they start to do things like Sosin'S ended up doing. And really getting the ice cream business into a big deal.